In the vastness of space, where civilizations spanning millennia have risen and fallen, where technologies beyond imagination have been mastered and forgotten, there exists a universal truth that every advanced species has learned to accept. Some beings are simply superior to others. The Zephyrians, with their crystalline intellects and computational minds, rule the galactic trade networks. The Mordak Empire, with their massive warships and unbreakable military discipline, control the Outer Rim territories. The ethereal Vailnari, masters of energy manipulation, govern the scientific councils that determine the fate of lesser species. And then there are humans, the newest addition to the galactic community, a species so unremarkable that most civilizations barely acknowledge their existence. Their technology is primitive, their lifespans laughably short, their physical capabilities embarrassingly weak. They have no psychic abilities, no natural armor, no inherited memories from ancient civilizations. They are, by every measurable standard, utterly insignificant, which is exactly why nobody saw Marcus coming. When a most advanced species in the galaxy discover that their carefully constructed reality has a fundamental flaw, when their unshakable beliefs about superiority and evolution crumble before the actions of a single human, they will learn a truth that has echoed through Earth's history for millennia. Never, ever underestimate the power of human ingenuity, determination, and the refusal to accept that something is impossible. What follows is not just the story of first contact gone wrong. It's the story of what happens when an entire galaxy realizes that their greatest mistake wasn't ignoring humanity. It was assuming they understood what humanity truly was. The detention cell aboard the Zephyrian flagship Infinite Calculation was designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in known space. Its walls were constructed from quantum-locked titanium composites that could withstand the full force of a stellar explosion. The energy fields that hummed between the molecular structure could suppress the psychic abilities of even the most powerful Vailnari masters. The atmospheric controls could adapt to any known species' biological requirements, while simultaneously preventing them from accessing their natural abilities. Marcus Chun sat on the simple metal bench in the center of the cell, his hands folded calmly in his lap, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus rather than a prisoner facing execution for crimes against galactic civilization. His appearance was utterly unremarkable by any standard. Medium height, brown hair that showed early signs of gray at the temples, dark eyes behind simple glasses that he'd somehow been allowed to keep. His clothes were the standard issue gray jumpsuit provided to all detainees, and nothing about his posture or expression suggested he was anything other than exactly what his captors believed him to be, an insignificant human who had somehow stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The three beings standing outside his cell represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Commander Zeph, 9947, whose crystalline body pulsed with the soft blue light of constant calculation, had an intellect that operated on 17 different dimensional levels simultaneously. His thought processes were so advanced that he could solve mathematical equations that would take human computers centuries to even understand, let alone complete. Next to him stood General Mordak the Unyielding, a massive creature whose obsidian exoskeleton had been forged in the heart of a dying star, and whose strategic mind had never known defeat in over 300 campaigns across the galaxy. The third figure was perhaps the most terrifying of all, Council Prime Vailna, whose ethereal form seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially in several others, and whose mastery over the fundamental forces of energy and matter was so complete that she could reshape reality with a thought. Fascinating. Zeph 9947's voice resonated through the crystalline formations that served as his vocal apparatus, creating harmonics that human ears could barely process. In all my calculations across all possible dimensional matrices, I cannot comprehend how this primitive being accomplished what our sensors indicate he accomplished. General Mordak's massive form shifted, the movement causing the deck plating beneath his feet to groan under the weight. The damage reports are beyond comprehension. 7 of our most advanced warships, each one capable of reducing a planet to cosmic dust, disabled completely. The defense grid around Nexus Prime, which has stood impregnable for over 10,000 years, offline and inoperable. And, most disturbing of all, our quantum communication network, the backbone of our entire civilization, compromised in ways that our best technicians cannot even begin to understand. Vailna's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A whisper that touched the minds of her companions directly rather than traveling through the crude medium of air vibrations. The energy signatures are impossible. The mathematical frameworks required to accomplish such feats do not exist. Even our most advanced theoretical models suggest that what he did should be physically impossible within the constraints of this universe. Marcus looked up from his contemplation of his hands, and for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not defiance, but something that might have been amusement. "You know," he said conversationally, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had grown up in the American Midwest. "Where I come from, we have a saying, impossible is just an opinion." The three beings exchanged what might have been glances if they had possessed conventional sensory organs. In the weeks since Marcus's capture, they had subjected him to every form of interrogation known to galactic science. Telepathic probes had found his mind to be curiously opaque, not defended exactly, but structured in ways that made psychic intrusion feel like trying to grab smoke. Chemical truth serums designed to break down the mental barriers of any known species had simply been metabolized and neutralized by his biological systems in ways that defied xenobiology. Physical torture was considered beneath civilized beings, but even stress analysis had revealed that his physiological responses followed no known patterns. Human Marcus Chun, Zeph, 9947 began, his voice taking on the formal tones reserved for official proceedings. "You stand accused of 17,000 counts of destruction of galactic property, for 1,000 counts of sabotage against protected infrastructure, 87 counts of illegal technological manipulation, and 1 count of actions threatening the stability of galactic civilization. The evidence against you is overwhelming and undeniable. The sentence, as decreed by the Galactic Council, is immediate termination followed by molecular disintegration to prevent any possibility of resurrection or reconstruction." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That does sound pretty serious. Mind if I ask you a question before you get to all that terminating and disintegrating?" The casualness of his tone was so unexpected that even these advanced beings found themselves momentarily off balance. Vailna's form flickered slightly, a sign of surprise in her species. "You may speak," she said after a moment. "Well," Marcus said, standing up and beginning to pace slowly around the small confines of his cell, "I've been thinking about this whole situation, and there's something that's been bothering me. You folks seem to pride yourselves on being logical, rational, advanced civilizations. You make decisions based on evidence and careful analysis, right?" "This is correct," General Mordak rumbled, though his tone carried a note of suspicion. "What is your point, human?" Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at his captors. "My point is this. If you really believe that a single human from a species you consider primitive and insignificant somehow managed to accomplish all the things you're accusing me of, then you're admitting one of two things. Either your understanding of what's possible is fundamentally flawed, or your understanding of what humans are capable of is fundamentally flawed. And if either of those things is true, then maybe, just maybe, you should be asking different questions." The silence that followed was profound. In the background, the subtle hum of the ship's systems seemed to grow louder, filling the space where words should have been. Zeph 9947's crystalline structure pulsed more rapidly, indicating accelerated thought processes. General Mordak's combat-trained instincts were triggering subtle threat assessment protocols. Vailna's ethereal form became more solid, a defensive mechanism that occurred when her species encountered something genuinely unexpected. Explain yourself, Zeph. 9947 finally said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones that suggested genuine curiosity alongside the suspicion. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since his capture, it was a real smile. Not the polite expression he had worn during the interrogations, but something that carried warmth and genuine amusement. You want to know what I did and how I did it, but you're asking the wrong questions. You should be asking why I did it. Because once you understand the why, the how becomes a lot less mysterious. He sat back down on the bench, but his posture was different now. More relaxed, more confident, as if some internal decision had been made. See, you've been operating under the assumption that I'm some kind of terrorist or saboteur. Someone who wanted to hurt your civilization or cause chaos for its own sake. But what if I told you that everything I did, every system I disabled, every ship I took offline, every network I compromised was done for one simple reason, to get your attention? Vailna's form flickered again, more pronounced this time. You are claiming that the destruction of billions of credits worth of infrastructure, the crippling of our most advanced technologies, the threatened destabilization of trade routes affecting 17-star systems, all of this was merely to communicate with us? Not just to communicate, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. To save you, all of you. Because while you've been congratulating yourselves on being the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, you've missed something. Something big. Something that's going to destroy everything you've built if someone doesn't do something about it. And do it fast. General Mordak's massive form leaned forward, his natural warrior instincts responding to the tone of genuine urgency that had entered Marcus's voice. What threat could a primitive species like yours have detected that our advanced sensors and monitoring systems have missed? Marcus looked at each of them in turn, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to age him years in the span of seconds. Because sometimes the most advanced tools in the universe can't see what's right in front of them. Sometimes it takes someone who doesn't know what's impossible to see what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is that your galaxy is dying. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Advanced though they were, the three beings found themselves processing an idea that their sophisticated minds have been carefully trained never to consider. The possibility that their vast technological superiority, their careful scientific methods, their millennia of accumulated knowledge, could have missed something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. Zeph 9947's crystalline structure had gone completely still, a sign that all of his processing power was being directed toward analyzing this new information. Elaborate, he said simply. Marcus stood up again and began what was clearly a prepared presentation, though he had no visual aids, no data displays, nothing but his words and the conviction in his voice. Your civilizations have been spacefaring for thousands of years. You've mapped every star system, cataloged every form of life, analyzed every energy signature, and built models that can predict the behavior of galactic phenomena with incredible accuracy. But there's something you've been treating as background noise, something so subtle and so gradual that your instruments register it as normal cosmic background radiation. He paused, letting the implications of his words sink in. What you're actually seeing is the signature of dimensional decay. The fundamental structure of space-time in this galaxy is breaking down. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily and inevitably. Your scientists have noticed the anomalies, slight variations in quantum field fluctuations, minor irregularities in subspace communications, occasional failures in technologies that should be theoretically perfect. But because these things happen rarely and randomly, they've been classified as acceptable margins of error. Vailna's ethereal form was now almost completely solid, a sign of intense concentration. Even if such a phenomenon were occurring, how would a species as technologically primitive as yours detect something that our most advanced instruments cannot? Marcus's smile returned, but this time it carried a different quality. Not amusement, but something that might have been pride. Because we approach problems differently. Your technologies are so advanced that they filter out what they consider irrelevant information. Our technologies are so primitive that they pick up everything. And when you're listening to everything, you start to notice patterns that more sophisticated systems miss because they're not looking for them. He began pacing again, but with purpose now, like a teacher walking in front of a classroom. We've been monitoring space for less than a century, using equipment that you would consider laughably crude. But our radio telescopes, our primitive sensors, our basic mathematical models, they've been picking up something that your advanced systems dismiss as noise. We call it the whisper frequency, a barely detectable pattern of electromagnetic fluctuations that seems to be getting stronger over time. General Mordak's combat instincts were now fully engaged, but not in preparation for battle. In recognition of a strategic briefing from someone who understood threats at a level that demanded respect. "Continue," he commanded. 3 years ago, Marcus continued, a group of human scientists noticed that this whisper frequency was becoming synchronized across multiple observation points. The pattern was subtle, but it was definitely there. It suggested that whatever was causing it was affecting the fundamental fabric of space itself, and that the effect was accelerating. Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at his captors. That's when we realized that this wasn't just an interesting scientific curiosity. This was an extinction-level event happening in slow motion. And when we tried to contact your civilizations to share our data and warn you about what we were seeing, we discovered something interesting. Zeph 9947's processing power was now operating at maximum capacity, creating new harmonic frequencies in his voice. What did you discover? We discovered that your communication networks, your data storage systems, your scientific databases, they're all designed to filter out information that doesn't match your existing models of reality. Our warnings, our data, our attempts to contact you, they were all being automatically classified as irrelevant noise and discarded. Your own technological sophistication was preventing you from seeing the very information you needed to survive. The implications of this revelation were staggering. These three beings represented civilizations that had conquered death, mastered the fundamental forces of the universe, and built technologies that seemed almost godlike in their scope and power. The idea that their very advancement could be a weakness, that their sophisticated systems could blind them to crucial information, challenged everything they understood about progress and evolution. Vailna spoke first, her voice carrying a note of what might have been uncertainty for the first time in millennia. You are suggesting that your species' technological primitiveness gave you an advantage in detecting this phenomenon? Not just suggesting, Marcus said firmly. Proving, because after we realized that we couldn't communicate with you through normal channels, we decided to do something that would definitely get your attention. We decided to demonstrate that our primitive understanding could do things that your advanced technology couldn't. Understanding began to dawn on the three captors, and with it came something that their species hadn't experienced in a very long time: genuine fear. The ships, General Mordak said slowly, his voice carrying a note of awe despite himself. The defense grids, the communication networks. You didn't attack them. You corrected them. Marcus nodded. Every system I disabled is actually running more efficiently now than it was before. Every network I compromised is actually carrying more data with less interference. Every ship I sabotaged is actually operating at performance levels that exceed their original design specifications. I wasn't destroying anything. I was fixing it, using principles that your advanced science considers impossible. The detention cell, suddenly, felt much smaller, as if the walls were closing in under the weight of implications too large for any physical space to contain. Everything these civilizations thought they knew about technology, about progress, about the very nature of advancement itself, was being challenged by a human in a gray jumpsuit who spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who understood things that they had never even considered. Zeph 9947's crystalline structure was now pulsing so rapidly that it was creating new colors, shades of light that a species only produced when processing information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. "Ow," he asked, and the single word carried the weight of desperate need to understand. Marcus looked at each of them again, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic, because sometimes the most primitive approach is the most effective one. You've spent thousands of years developing technologies that work within the framework of what you understand about the universe. But what if that framework is incomplete? What if there are aspects of reality that can only be accessed by approaches that you consider crude or simplistic? He sat down one more time, but his posture was that of someone preparing to deliver the most important information of his life. "Where I come from, we have scientists and engineers and theorists just like you do. But we also have people called makers, individuals who build things without always understanding why they work. We have artists who create beauty without following rules. We have inventors who solve problems by ignoring the limitations that everyone else accepts as absolute." Marcus spread his hands in a gesture that somehow conveyed both humility and confidence. "Your civilizations have evolved beyond the need for that kind of thinking. You've become so efficient, so logical, so advanced, that you've lost the ability to see solutions that don't fit within your existing paradigms. And that's exactly why you missed the dimensional decay, and that's exactly why you couldn't fix the problems I fixed." The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet moments. This was the silence of minds grappling with concepts that threatened to reshape everything they thought they knew about themselves, their civilizations, and the universe they thought they had mastered. Finally, Velna spoke, and her voice carried a quality that her species had not experienced in over 1,000 years: humility. "Human Marcus Chun," she said formally, "it appears that we have gravely misunderstood both your actions and your motivations. If what you say is true, if our galaxy is indeed facing the threat you describe, then we owe you not punishment but gratitude." Marcus smiled again, and this time was the warm, slightly tired smile of someone who had carried a heavy burden for a long time and was finally ready to set it down. "The gratitude can wait," he said. "Right now, we need to focus on the real problem, because everything I've told you so far, that's just a setup. The dimensional decay, the whisper frequency, the communication problems, they're all symptoms of something much bigger. Something that's going to require every advanced civilization in this galaxy to work together if we're going to have any chance of stopping it." He stood up one final time, and when he looked at his former captors, they saw something in his eyes that they had never expected to see in any being, let alone a primitive human. The absolute certainty of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done and exactly how much was at stake. "The question now," Marcus said quietly, "is whether you're ready to listen to what a primitive human has to say about saving your galaxy." Outside the detention cell, alarm klaxons began to sound as sensors throughout the ship detected something that their designers had never programmed them to recognize: the quantum signature of dimensional barriers beginning to collapse, exactly as a human named Marcus Chun had predicted they would. The council chamber aboard Nexus Prime had not seen an emergency session of this magnitude in over 3,000 years. Representatives from 47 different civilizations had gathered in person, their various forms of existence creating a bizarre tableau of galactic diversity. Some attended as physical beings, others as energy constructs, and still more as quantum consciousness projections. The air itself hummed with translation matrices working overtime to convert thousands of different communication methods into comprehensible dialogue. At the center of it all sat Marcus Chun, still wearing his gray detention jumpsuit, still looking remarkably ordinary despite being the focus of attention from some of the most powerful beings in known space. A simple human chair had been requisitioned for him. The standard seating in the council chamber was designed for beings whose physiological requirements differed dramatically from baseline human parameters. The past 18 hours had transformed the entire dynamic of galactic civilization. The alarm that had sounded during Marcus's confession had been followed by a cascade of similar alerts from monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. The dimensional decay he had described was not only real, but accelerating far more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. What should have been a gradual process taking place over millions of years was now clearly operating on a timeline measured in months, not millennia. Chancellor Vextar of the Hegemony Coalition, whose species had evolved from silicon-based crystalline structures similar to the Zephyrians, but with greater individual autonomy, called the session to order with a harmonic tone that translated as barely controlled panic. Fellow representatives of the galactic community, we face an unprecedented crisis. The information provided by the human Marcus Chun has been verified by our most advanced scientific analysis teams. The threat to our galaxy is real, immediate, and beyond anything our existing technologies can address. A ripple of what might have been nervous energy passed through the assembled beings. For civilizations accustomed to solving problems through the application of superior technology and accumulated knowledge, the admission that their tools were inadequate represented a fundamental challenge to their worldview. Dr. Keth Mori, the foremost theoretical physicist among the Vailnari, and someone whose understanding of dimensional mechanics was considered absolute even by the standards of his incredibly advanced species, materialized more fully into the physical dimension to address the assembly. The data is troubling. Our initial analysis suggests that the dimensional substrate underlying normal spacetime has been deteriorating for approximately 47,000 years. The process appears to have natural causes, but the acceleration observed in recent decades cannot be explained by any known physical phenomena. Marcus raised his hand slightly, the gesture so casual and human that several representatives actually paused their own communication to observe this primitive display of social protocol. Actually, that's not quite correct, he said politely. The acceleration isn't natural. It's artificial, and that's the real problem we need to talk about. The chamber fell silent with a completeness that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Dr. Keth Mori's ethereal form flickered rapidly, indicating processing speed that exceeded even his species' normal capabilities. Explain, he said simply. Marcus leaned forward slightly, settling into what was clearly going to be a lengthy explanation. When my colleagues and I first detected the whisper frequency, we noticed that it wasn't random. There were patterns within patterns, mathematical relationships that suggested purpose rather than natural phenomenon. At first, we thought we were seeing the signature of some kind of natural galactic process that we didn't understand yet. But when we started tracking the source points of the strongest signals, we found something unexpected. He paused to ensure he had everyone's attention, a completely unnecessary gesture given that every sensor, recording device, and consciousness in the chamber was focused on his words with unprecedented intensity. The signals were strongest in regions of space that your civilizations have designated as dead zones, areas where the background radiation is too high for normal space travel, where quantum fluctuations make standard navigation impossible, where your most advanced sensors can't penetrate effectively. General Mordak, who had been granted special permission to attend despite his military rather than diplomatic status, leaned forward with interest. Those regions have been avoided for good reason. They are inherently hazardous to any known form of technology or biological existence. Exactly, Marcus said, his tone carrying a note of grim satisfaction. They're perfect hiding places, and that's exactly what they're being used for. Someone or something has been using those dead zones to construct artificial amplifiers for the dimensional decay process. They're not just watching your galaxy die, they're actively helping it along. The implications hit the assembled representatives like a physical force. The idea that the threat to their galaxy was not only artificial, but deliberately engineered by some unknown intelligence transformed this from a natural disaster that might be solved through scientific innovation into a war scenario that would require entirely different approaches. Ambassador Thrill Ek of the Outer Colonies, whose species had developed advanced pattern recognition abilities as a survival mechanism on their chaotic homeworld, was the first to voice the question that everyone was thinking. Who? What intelligence possesses the technological capability to engineer dimensional decay on a galactic scale? Such a project would require resources and knowledge beyond anything in our historical records. Marcus's expression grew more serious, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice that suggested personal experience with whatever he was describing. That's where things get complicated. Based on our analysis of the signal patterns, the artificial amplifiers, and the mathematical frameworks required to coordinate this kind of operation, we believe the entities responsible are operating from outside this dimensional framework entirely. Dr. Keth Mori's form became almost completely solid, indicating the mental equivalent of a defensive posture. Impossible. Transdimensional travel on any meaningful scale violates fundamental laws of energy conservation. The power requirements alone would exceed the total output of a galaxy's worth of stars. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed. If they were trying to exist in this dimension the way you do. But what if they're not? What if they're using the dimensional decay itself as a power source? What if the destruction of space-time in this galaxy is actually feeding energy back to them in their home dimension? The silence that followed was profound enough that the chamber's atmosphere processors automatically adjusted their output, interpreting the lack of normal biological and technological activity as a sign of potential system failure. Chancellor Vextar's crystalline structure had taken on a distinctly darker hue, a sign of deep concern in his species. You are describing a scenario of cosmic predation. Beings from another dimension systematically destroying galaxies to harvest dimensional energy. Such entities would be gods, finished Counselor Isef of the Eternal Archive, whose species had spent millions of years collecting and preserving knowledge from across the galaxy. Beings whose power and scope of operation would render them effectively omnipotent from our perspective. Marcus shook his head firmly. No, not gods, just really advanced beings with a different approach to problem-solving than yours. And that's important because gods can't be fought. But really advanced beings? They can make mistakes. They can be outwitted. They can be stopped. He stood up and began the same kind of purposeful pacing that he had used in his detention cell. But now his audience consisted of the leadership of galactic civilization rather than three confused captors. See, these beings have been operating on the assumption that the civilizations in this galaxy would respond to dimensional decay the way most advanced species respond to existential threats, with increasingly sophisticated technology designed to mitigate the symptoms rather than address the root cause. General Mordak's strategic mind was already beginning to follow the logic. They expected us to focus on protecting individual systems, developing better shielding, finding ways to work around the decay rather than stopping it. Exactly. And for the most part, that's exactly what you've been doing. Every time one of your advanced systems failed in a way that couldn't be explained, you built redundancies. Every time quantum communications became unreliable, you developed new protocols. Every time dimensional stability fluctuated, you created better compensation algorithms. You've been treating the symptoms while ignoring the disease, which is exactly what they wanted you to do. Marcus stopped pacing and faced the assembly directly, but they made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that a galaxy containing only advanced civilizations would only produce advanced solutions. They never considered that somewhere in this galaxy, there might be a species so primitive, so technologically backwards, so completely unsophisticated, that they would approach the problem from a direction that advanced beings would never consider. Ambassador Thrillex's pattern recognition abilities were working overtime, and the conclusions they were reaching were clearly disturbing her. Human Marcus, are you suggesting that your species' technological primitiveness is actually an advantage in this situation? I'm not suggesting it, Marcus said with a slight smile. I'm stating it as proven fact, because while your advanced sensors were filtering out the artificial signals as background noise, our primitive radio telescopes were recording them. While your sophisticated algorithms were compensating for dimensional instabilities, our crude equipment was measuring them. While your complex theoretical models were explaining away the anomalies, our simple observations were documenting the patterns. Dr. Kethmori's form flickered with what might have been intellectual excitement despite the dire circumstances. You detected the artificial nature of the dimensional decay because your observational methods were too primitive to be fooled by the camouflaging techniques designed to deceive advanced civilizations. Exactly. And more importantly, our primitive understanding of dimensional mechanics means that we approach problems in ways that beings from a higher dimensional framework wouldn't anticipate. They've spent considerable effort making sure that any advanced technological solution to dimensional decay would actually accelerate the process. But they never considered solutions that don't rely on advanced technology. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small device constructed from materials that most of the assembled beings would have considered worthless scrap. Copper wire, basic semiconductors, simple magnetic components, all assembled with techniques that predated galactic civilization by millions of years. This, he said, holding up the device, is what humans call a breadboard prototype. It's built using techniques that your species abandoned before they achieved spaceflight. The total computational power of this device is less than what any of your civilizations would use to regulate atmospheric temperature in a single room. And with proper deployment, it can completely neutralize the artificial amplifiers that are driving dimensional decay in this galaxy. The chamber erupted in what could only be described as controlled chaos. Translation matrices struggled to keep up with the rapid exchanges of disbelief, excitement, and desperate hope that filled the air. The idea that a solution to their galaxy-threatening crisis could exist in the form of primitive technology operated according to principles they had long since transcended was almost impossible to process. Chancellor Vextar's harmonic tones cut through the noise with the authority of his office. Silence. Human Marcus, please explain the principles behind this proposed solution. Marcus sat back down, cradling the primitive device in his hands like it was the most precious object in the galaxy, which from a certain perspective, it might have been. The artificial amplifiers work by creating quantum resonance patterns that destabilize the fundamental structure of space-time. They're incredibly sophisticated, operating on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously, using mathematical frameworks that are probably beyond anything your civilizations have developed. He held up the breadboard device. But they have one weakness. The resonance patterns they create are so complex, so precisely tuned, that they can be disrupted by introducing simple harmonic frequencies at specific points in the amplification cycle. It's like, imagine you have a perfectly tuned musical instrument, and someone starts playing a simple tune badly nearby. The precision of the instrument actually makes it more susceptible to disruption from crude interference. Dr. Kethmori was now fluctuating between dimensions so rapidly that he was beginning to look like a strobe light. The theoretical framework is primitive but theoretically sound. However, the deployment challenges would be enormous. These amplifiers are located in regions of space that our most advanced ships cannot safely navigate. Which is why we're not going to use advanced ships, Marcus said simply. We're going to use the most primitive, most crude, most technologically backwards approach possible. We're going to build ships that are so simple, so unsophisticated, that the hostile environment in those dead zones can't disable them, because there's nothing complex enough to be disabled. General Mordak's strategic mind was beginning to see the outlines of what Marcus was proposing, and the implications were staggering. You were suggesting a military campaign using deliberately primitive technology against entities that can manipulate the fundamental structure of reality. I'm suggesting, Marcus corrected gently, that we fight fire with water instead of trying to fight it with more sophisticated fire. The entities behind this have planned for every possible advanced response. They haven't planned for the possibility that someone might respond with techniques so primitive that they predate the technological frameworks that the entities understand. He stood up again, And this time when he looked at the assembled representatives, there was something in his expression that spoke to the warrior spirit that existed in every species that had ever struggled for survival. The question is whether your civilizations are willing to temporarily step backwards in order to move forward. Whether you're prepared to set aside your technological superiority and work with approaches that you consider beneath you. Whether you can accept that sometimes the most primitive solution is the most effective one. Ambassador ThrillX pattern recognition abilities have been working throughout Marcus's explanation, and the conclusion they had reached was both terrifying and hopeful. Human Marcus, you are asking us to voluntarily abandon the technological advances that define our civilizations, to embrace primitive methodologies that we evolved beyond millions of years ago, and to place our survival in the hands of approaches that we cannot fully understand or control. Marcus nodded seriously. Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. Because the alternative is the complete destruction of everything you've built, everything you've learned, and everything you are. The entities engineering this dimensional decay are counting on your unwillingness to consider primitive solutions. They're betting that your technological pride will prevent you from taking the only course of action that can save a galaxy. He looked around the chamber, making what appeared to be eye contact with representatives whose sensory organs bore no resemblance to human eyes. But here's the thing about humans that you need to understand. We've been the underdog in every major conflict we've ever faced. We've survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, planetary disasters, and each other, not because we had the best technology or the most sophisticated understanding of the universe, but because we were willing to try anything, no matter how crude or primitive or desperate, if it had even the slightest chance of working. Marcus sat down one final time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Your civilizations have spent millions of years becoming advanced. But advancement isn't always about moving forward. Sometimes it's about being wise enough to step back. Sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is choose to be primitive. The silence that followed was different from any that had preceded it. This was not the silence of confusion or fear, but the silence of minds grappling with a choice that would define the future of galactic civilization. They could maintain their technological pride and face extinction, or they could embrace primitiveness and survive. In the end, it was General Mordak who spoke first, his massive form radiating the kind of determined resolve that had made him legendary across the galaxy. Human Marcus Chun, he said formally, the Mordak Empire places its fleets at your disposal. Tell us what primitive ships you need built, and we will build them. One by one, the other representatives began to voice their agreement, each one representing a civilization's willingness to abandon everything they thought they knew about advancement in order to embrace the primitive wisdom of a species they had dismissed as insignificant. Outside the council chamber, in the dead zones at the edges of known space, artificial amplifiers continued their work of destroying the galaxy, operated by entities who had never considered that their greatest threat might come not from advanced technology, but from copper wire and simple determination. The shipyard orbiting Kepler 442b had been transformed into something that no advanced civilization had seen for millions of years, a construction facility dedicated to building primitive technology. Where once robotic assemblers would have constructed vessels using molecular-level precision, teams of beings from dozens of different species now worked with basic tools, following blueprint specifications that seemed almost insultingly simple. Marcus Chun moved through the controlled chaos of the construction bay, his presence somehow managing to bring order to projects that seemed to defy every principle of advanced engineering. In the 3 weeks since the emergency council session, word of the primitive fleet project had spread throughout the galaxy, and volunteers had arrived from civilizations that had barely spoken to each other in centuries. Commander Zeph 9947, whose crystalline structure had been modified to allow for more direct interaction with primitive tools, was struggling with what his species would have considered the equivalent of stone knives and bearskins. His current task involved manually connecting copper wiring according to specifications that Marcus had drawn by hand on actual paper, a substance that most advanced civilizations used only for historical documentation. Human Marcus, Zeph 9947's harmonic voice, carried notes of frustration that his species rarely experienced. I am attempting to understand the logical framework behind these design specifications. According to every computational model I can construct, this vessel should not be capable of maintaining structural integrity in normal space, let alone surviving the extreme conditions present in the dead zones. Marcus looked up from his own work, which involved the apparently impossible task of teaching a Vailnari energy being how to operate a manual soldering iron. That's because you're still thinking like an advanced civilization, he said patiently. You're trying to understand why these designs work instead of just accepting that they do work. Sometimes understanding comes after success, not before it. Across the construction bay, General Mordak was experiencing his own form of cultural shock. The massive warrior, whose strategic mind had orchestrated victories across hundreds of star systems, was currently learning how to operate what humans called a hammer. The concept of using kinetic force applied through simple mechanical advantage to shape metal was so far removed from his species' normal technological approaches that it felt like learning to think in an entirely different language. The inefficiency is profound, he rumbled to Dr. Kethmori, who was nearby struggling with the concept of measuring twice, cutting once as he attempted to prepare hull plating using tools that had no computational assistance whatsoever. These construction methods require approximately 47,000% more time and resources than our standard fabrication techniques. Dr. Kethmori's ethereal form flickered with what might have been philosophical contemplation. Perhaps efficiency is not the primary goal of this approach. Perhaps there are aspects of the construction process itself that contribute to the final functionality in ways that our advanced methods cannot replicate. He was closer to the truth than he realized. The ships taking shape in the construction bay were not just primitive in their technology. They were primitive in their very conceptual foundation. Every component was designed to be understandable by a single individual. Every system could be repaired with basic tools. Every connection was made through direct physical contact rather than quantum field manipulation or energy-based interfaces. Marcus had insisted on this approach despite protests from engineers whose species had been building starships for millions of years. The entities we're fighting, he had explained during one of the many design meetings, have spent considerable effort learning how to disrupt advanced technology. They understand quantum mechanics, energy fields, subspace physics, dimensional mathematics, all the sophisticated principles that your ships rely on. But they don't understand simple mechanical systems because nobody has used simple mechanical systems for galactic-level conflicts in longer than their recorded history. The first ship to near completion was designated Primitive 1, a name that Marcus had chosen specifically to emphasize its non-advanced nature. From the outside, it looked like something that might have been built by a species that had just discovered metallurgy. Its hull was composed of simple steel alloys, welded together with techniques that predated most galactic civilizations. Its propulsion system relied on chemical rockets, controlled explosions that generated thrust through Newton's third law rather than manipulation of exotic matter or space-time distortion. Ambassador Thrillek, whose pattern recognition abilities had made her one of the most valuable contributors to the project, approached Marcus as he conducted what appeared to be a final inspection of the vessel's command systems. The bridge of Primitive 1 contained no holographic displays, no quantum computers, no neural interface connections. Instead, it featured banks of analog gauges, mechanical switches, and simple electronic readouts that could have been built using technology available to humans centuries before they achieved spaceflight. Human Marcus, she said, her species' natural curiosity evident in her vocal patterns, I have been analyzing the design philosophy behind this vessel, and I believe I am beginning to understand your approach. This ship is not designed to be superior to advanced technology. It is designed to be completely incompatible with the frameworks that advanced technology uses. Marcus nodded approvingly as he checked the calibration on a simple pressure gauge that monitored the ship's atmospheric systems. Exactly. The entity's engineering dimensional decay understand how to interfere with quantum field generators, how to disrupt subspace communication, how to overload exotic matter containment systems. But they have no frameworks for dealing with a ship that determines its position by looking at stars through a telescope, that navigates by calculating trajectories with mechanical computers, that maintains life support through chemical filtration systems. He gestured toward the ship's navigation station, where a device that could only be described as a mechanical computer sat next to what was unmistakably a simple telescope. These systems don't interact with dimensional fields, don't generate exotic energy signatures, don't rely on quantum entanglement or subspace phenomena. From a perspective of beings who exist in higher dimensions, this ship might as well be invisible. The past 3 weeks had seen similar construction projects beginning at shipyards throughout the galaxy. Each civilization was contributing according to their capabilities, but all were following the same basic principle: deliberate technological regression in service of tactical advantage. The Mordak Empire's foundries, normally used to forge quantum-locked titanium composites, were now producing simple steel plate. The Vailnari's energy manipulation facilities were being used to power basic electrical generators. The Zephyrian computational networks were running calculations for mechanical gear ratios and chemical propellant mixtures. It represented the largest cooperative effort in galactic history, and it was entirely dedicated to building technology that any of the participating civilizations could have constructed millions of years ago. Dr. YSS Ra, the chief xenobiologist from the Scientific Coalition, had initially been skeptical of the project's biological components. The primitive ships would require crews, and the hostile conditions in the dead zones would challenge even the most advanced life support systems. But Marcus had insisted that the crew requirements were actually an advantage rather than a limitation. Advanced ships require specialized operators, he had explained during one of the crew selection meetings. Personnel who understand quantum mechanics, subspace physics, exotic matter containment. But primitive ships can be operated by anyone willing to learn basic mechanical principles. And, more importantly, beings operating primitive technology think differently than beings operating advanced technology. The crew selection process had been unlike anything in galactic history. Instead of choosing the most qualified and experienced spacefaring personnel, Marcus had specifically requested volunteers who had minimal experience with advanced starship operations. Artists, philosophers, historians, craftspeople, individuals whose thinking patterns had not been shaped by centuries of dependence on sophisticated technology. Commander Zeph, 9947, had initially protested this approach. You are asking us to staff these vessels with individuals who have no understanding of spacefaring operations, no training in crisis management, no experience with the psychological stresses of deep space travel. I'm asking you to staff them with people who can think outside the paradigms that advanced technology creates, Marcus had corrected. When something goes wrong on an advanced ship, the crew looks for a technological solution. When something goes wrong on a primitive ship, the crew has to be creative. They have to improvise. They have to find solutions that don't exist in any manual or training program. Now, as the first ships neared completion, that unconventional crew selection process was proving its value. The bridge crew of Primitive One included a Zephyrian artist whose understanding of pattern and harmony translated perfectly to navigation by stellar observation, a Mordak historian whose knowledge of ancient tactical principles provided insight into strategies that had been forgotten for millennia, and a Vailnari philosopher whose ability to perceive connections between disparate concepts made her an ideal systems coordinator for technology that required intuitive rather than computational understanding. The first test flight of Primitive One was scheduled for the following day, and the entire Primitive Fleet project was holding its collective breath. The ship's destination was one of the closest dead zones, a region of space that had been avoided by galactic civilization for over 2,000 years. If Marcus's theories were correct, the primitive vessel should be able to navigate through conditions that would disable or destroy any advanced ship within minutes of entering the zone. As Marcus completed his inspection of the ship's final systems, he was joined by the three beings who had originally captured him: Commander Zeph, 9947, General Mordak, and Council Prime Vailna. The transformation in their understanding over the past weeks had been remarkable to observe. Beings who had initially seen him as a primitive terrorist now looked to him for guidance on matters that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their civilizations. Human Marcus, Vailna said, her ethereal form more solid than usual, a sign that she was focusing her entire attention on their conversation. There is a question that we have not yet addressed. If this primitive approach is successful, if we are able to disable the artificial amplifiers and stop the dimensional decay, what then? How do our civilizations proceed forward knowing that our greatest advancement may have been our willingness to step backward? It was a profound question that touched on issues far beyond the immediate crisis they were facing. The Primitive Fleet Project had already begun to change the way that advanced civilizations thought about technology, progress, and the very nature of problem solving. If it succeeded, those changes would be permanent. Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. I think, he said slowly, that what you'll discover is that advancement isn't about always moving forward. Real advancement is about having the wisdom to choose the right tool for each specific problem. Sometimes that tool will be incredibly sophisticated technology that can manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. Sometimes it will be a hammer and some copper wire. He looked at each of them in turn. Your civilizations have spent millions of years developing amazing capabilities. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that the goal of technology should be to solve problems, not to demonstrate sophistication. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy should also be the most capable of choosing simple solutions, when simple solutions are what the problem requires. General Mordak's massive form shifted in what his species recognized as a gesture of deep respect. You have taught us something that we did not know we had forgotten, human Marcus. That true strength sometimes means choosing to appear weak. That real advancement sometimes means choosing to be primitive. Commander Zeph 9947's crystalline structure pulsed with new harmonic frequencies, patterns that his species had not generated since their early evolutionary stages, when they still relied on intuition and creativity rather than pure computational analysis. The logical frameworks are elegant in their simplicity, but more than that, they are effective in ways that our sophisticated alternatives cannot match. Marcus smiled, looking out through the construction bay's observation windows at the small fleet of deliberately primitive ships that now represented the galaxy's best hope for survival. Tomorrow we'll find out if being underestimated by cosmic predators is as useful as being underestimated by advanced civilizations. As the three beings left to complete their own preparations for the test flight, Marcus remained behind, running his hands over the simple controls of Primitive One. Everything that human civilization had learned about ingenuity, determination, and the refusal to accept impossibility was built into the ship and the others like it. In the dead zones at the edges of known space, artificial amplifiers continued their work of destroying the galaxy, operated by entities who had planned for every possible response from advanced civilizations. They had not planned for the possibility that the galaxy's greatest strength might come from its most primitive inhabitants. The test flight would prove whether the most advanced beings in the galaxy had finally learned what humans had always known, that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to refuse to understand why it's impossible. The dead zone designated as Sector Null 47 had been avoided by galactic civilization for over 2 millennia. The region of space existed in a state of perpetual quantum flux, where the normal laws of physics seemed to operate according to principles that defied conventional understanding. Energy fields fluctuated wildly, subspace communications became impossible, and The background radiation levels were sufficient to overload even the most heavily shielded advanced sensors within minutes of exposure. It was, according to every scientific model developed by galactic civilization, completely hostile to technological life, which made it the perfect testing ground for Primitive One. Marcus Chun stood on the bridge of the deliberately crude starship, watching analog readouts that tracked their approach to the dead zone's edge through simple electromagnetic sensors and basic optical telescopy. The bridge crew moved with the careful coordination of beings who had spent weeks learning to operate technology that their species had abandoned before achieving spaceflight, but their movements were confident despite the alien nature of their equipment. Navigator Zeph, 7741, the Zephyrian artist whose pattern recognition abilities had proven perfectly suited to stellar navigation by visual observation, called out their position using coordinates calculated by mechanical computation rather than quantum positioning systems. Approach vector nominal, human Marcus. We are maintaining stable trajectory using chemical propulsion. Estimated time to dead zone boundary, 17 minutes. Systems Coordinator Veilsom monitored the ship's primitive life support systems through a collection of pressure gauges, temperature readouts, and chemical analysis displays that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a starship. Her ethereal form had learned to interact with purely physical controls in ways that her species had not needed to master for millions of years. Atmosphérique composition stable. Chemical filtration systems operating within normal parameters. Mechanical backup systems ready for deployment. Tactical Officer Moreth, whose knowledge of ancient military strategies had proven invaluable in developing operational procedures for technology that possessed no computational assistance, tracked their approach using techniques that predated galactic civilization. Passive sensor arrays detecting increased radiation levels consistent with dead zone boundaries. No energy signatures suggesting active monitoring or response systems. The hostile environment appears to be natural rather than artificially maintained. Marcus nodded approvingly as he monitored the ship's overall status through readouts that would have been familiar to human engineers from centuries past. Everything was operating exactly as designed. The primitive systems were functioning in perfect harmony, untroubled by the exotic phenomena that would have wreaked havoc on advanced technology. The real test, however, was yet to come. All stations, prepare for dead zone entry, Marcus announced, his voice carrying through the ship via simple intercom systems rather than neural communication networks. Remember, we're not here to fight anything or prove anything. We're here to demonstrate that primitive technology can operate in an environment where advanced technology cannot. If everything goes according to plan, this should be the most boring test flight in galactic history. As Primitive One crossed the boundary into Sector Null 47, the transformation was immediately apparent to anyone monitoring from outside the dead zone. Advanced sensors tracking the ship's progress suddenly lost all contact, just as they had with every vessel that had ever attempted to enter such regions. From the perspective of galactic civilization's technological infrastructure, the primitive ship had simply vanished. But inside the ship, the crew experienced something entirely different. The analog gauges continued to function perfectly, tracking atmospheric pressure, temperature, radiation levels, and structural stress with simple mechanical precision. The chemical propulsion system operated exactly as designed, generating thrust through controlled combustion that was completely unaffected by the exotic energy fields that filled the dead zone. The life support systems maintained perfect environmental conditions using filtration and circulation methods that relied on basic physics rather than technological sophistication. Most remarkably of all, the crew themselves felt no ill effects from entering what was supposed to be the most hostile environment in known space. The quantum fluctuations that would have interfered with the neural processes of beings accustomed to advanced technology simply had no impact on consciousness operating according to purely biological principles. Navigator Zeph 7741's harmonic voice carried a note of wonder that his species rarely experienced. Human Marcus, our position tracking systems remain fully functional. Visual navigation by stellar reference is completely unimpaired by the environmental conditions. In fact, the absence of technological interference is making stellar observation more precise than it would be in normal space. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he checked the ship's internal systems. Everything was operating so smoothly that it almost felt anticlimactic. That's because there's nothing here that was designed to interfere with primitive technology. The hostile conditions in dead zones are specifically calibrated to disable advanced systems. When you remove advanced systems from the equation, the environment becomes just another region of space with some unusual radiation characteristics. Systems Coordinator Vale Sci's ethereal form flickered with excitement as she monitored the primitive life support systems. The chemical filtration arrays are actually operating more efficiently than predicted. The high-energy particles present in this environment are being captured and processed by our mechanical systems in ways that provide additional atmospheric purification. Tactical Officer Moreth was tracking their progress through the dead zone using techniques that would have seemed impossibly crude to advanced civilizations, but which were proving remarkably effective in practice. Long-range sensors detecting artificial structures approximately 47,000 kilometers ahead of our current position. Configuration is consistent with human Marcus's descriptions of the artificial amplifiers. There it was. Proof that the dead zones weren't just natural phenomena, but deliberate hiding places for technology designed to destroy galactic civilization from within. The artificial amplifiers that were engineering dimensional decay on a galactic scale, hidden in regions of space where advanced civilizations couldn't observe or interfere with them. Marcus felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces of his theory fell into place. Take us in for a closer look, but maintain safe distance. We're not here to engage the amplifiers yet. This is a reconnaissance mission. We need to verify that primitive technology can not only operate in these conditions, but can also observe and analyze the artificial infrastructure without being detected. As Primitive 1 approached the artificial amplifiers, the true scope of the enemy's operation became apparent. The structures were massive, extending across hundreds of kilometers of space, built using technologies that operated on dimensional frameworks far beyond anything that galactic civilization had achieved. They pulsed with energies that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in higher dimensions, creating the resonance patterns that were systematically destroying the fundamental structure of the galaxy. But from the perspective of primitive sensors, the amplifiers were surprisingly easy to observe and analyze. The simple electromagnetic detection systems that Primitive 1 carried were unaffected by the exotic shielding that would have made the structures invisible to advanced scanning technology. The mechanical computers that processed the sensor data operated according to principles so basic that the amplifier's defensive systems simply didn't recognize them as technological threats. Navigator Zeph 7741 was recording measurements using techniques that his species had abandoned millions of years ago, but which were proving perfectly adequate for analyzing technology that existed partially outside normal space-time. Structural configuration suggests modular construction with component units arranged according to mathematical principles designed to maximize dimensional interference patterns. The resonance frequencies being generated match the theoretical frameworks the human Marcus provided for dimensional decay acceleration. Systems Coordinator Vale Sci was monitoring the amplifier's energy output through sensors so primitive that they measured radiation levels by tracking the ionization of simple chemical compounds. Power generation appears to be drawing energy directly from dimensional boundaries. The amplification process is definitely artificial and appears to be designed for maximum efficiency rather than concealment. Tactical Officer Moreth's analysis was based on strategic principles that predated galactic civilization, but which provided insights that advanced military science would have missed. Defensive positioning suggests the amplifiers were designed to counter threats from advanced civilizations using standard technological approaches. No apparent defensive systems targeted at primitive technology or mechanical systems. Marcus absorbed this information with the satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by direct observation. The entities behind dimensional decay had planned for every possible response from advanced civilizations, but they had never considered the possibility of primitive technology being used for galactic-scale operations. All stations begin detailed recording of amplifier configurations and operational parameters, he ordered. We need complete documentation of everything we're observing. This information will be crucial for planning the actual mission to disable these systems. For the next several hours, Primitive 1 conducted the most comprehensive reconnaissance of artificial amplifier technology that had ever been possible. The primitive sensors recorded measurements that advanced instruments could never have obtained. The mechanical computers processed data according to algorithms so simple that the amplifier's defensive systems never recognized them as analysis tools. The crew documented structural details and operational patterns that had been completely invisible to galactic civilizations' sophisticated monitoring systems. Most importantly, they confirmed that the amplifiers were indeed vulnerable to the kind of simple harmonic interference that Marcus had proposed. The resonance patterns that were destroying the galaxy operated according to mathematical principles so precise that they could be disrupted by introducing crude frequency generators at specific points in the amplification cycle. As Primitive 1 completed its reconnaissance and began the journey back toward normal space, the crew experienced something that none of their species had felt for millions of years: the satisfaction of solving a complex problem using simple tools and direct observation rather than technological sophistication. Navigator Zeph 7741's harmonic patterns carried notes of philosophical revelation. Human Marcus, this mission has demonstrated something that my species had forgotten was possible. There are aspects of reality that can only be properly observed through primitive methods. Our advanced sensors would have missed crucial details that simple electromagnetic detection revealed clearly. Systems Coordinator Valesaw's ethereal form was more solid than usual, indicating intense concentration as she processed the implications of their successful mission. The efficiency of primitive technology in this environment suggests that our civilizations may have evolved beyond optimal functionality for certain types of problems. Sometimes advancement means developing capabilities that are less capable than what we previously possessed. Tactical Officer Moreth was already thinking ahead to the strategic implications of their discoveries. The reconnaissance data we have gathered will enable the development of attack strategies that the amplifiers cannot counter because they were designed to defend against different types of threats entirely. As Primitive 1 emerged from the dead zone and re-established contact with galactic civilization, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions: satisfaction at the success of his theories, determination to complete the mission ahead, and something that might have been sadness at what this success represented about the limitations of advanced thinking. The transmission from Nexus Prime came through on simple radio frequencies rather than subspace communications, partly because the primitive ship lacked subspace capability, but mostly because Marcus wanted to emphasize the deliberate primitiveness of their approach. Primitive 1 *. This is Nexus Prime Control. Please confirm your status and mission results. Marcus activated the ship's basic radio transmitter, a device so simple that it could have been built using components available to human civilization centuries before they achieved spaceflight. Nexus Prime Control. This is Primitive 1. Mission successful. Dead zone penetration achieved with no technological difficulties. Artificial amplifiers located, analyzed, and confirmed vulnerable to proposed countermeasures. Primitive technology proves fully effective for operations in hostile dimensional environments. The silence that followed was profound. Despite their theoretical understanding of what primitive technology should be able to accomplish, actually hearing confirmation that it had worked was transformative for civilizations that had spent millions of years believing that advancement always meant increasing sophistication. Finally, Chancellor Vextar's harmonic voice came through the simple radio receiver. Asterisk primitive 1 asterisk. Please return to dock immediately. Emergency council session is being convened to review your findings and authorize full-scale primitive fleet deployment. The future of galactic civilization now depends on our willingness to embrace approaches that we had believed we had evolved beyond. As the primitive ship began its journey back to the construction yards, Marcus looked out at the stars through simple optical viewers, thinking about how those same stars look different when observed through primitive technology versus advanced sensors. Neither view was more correct than the other, but they revealed different aspects of reality. The real test would come when the full primitive fleet was deployed to disable every artificial amplifier in every dead zone throughout the galaxy. But for the first time since discovering the dimensional decay crisis, Marcus felt genuinely optimistic about their chances. The entities behind the galactic destruction had made one critical error. They had assumed that advanced civilizations would always choose advanced solutions. They had never considered that the most advanced choice might be to deliberately become primitive. Tomorrow, they would learn just how dangerous that error had been. 3 months after the first primitive fleet deployment, the galaxy was experiencing something unprecedented in recorded history: technological regression on a civilizational scale. Shipyards that had produced vessels capable of manipulating exotic matter were now manufacturing ships built from steel and copper. Research facilities that had unlocked the secrets of dimensional physics were developing new applications for mechanical engineering principles. Military academies were teaching courses in pre-spaceflight tactics and manual navigation techniques. It was the largest coordinated effort in galactic history, and it was entirely dedicated to becoming less advanced. Marcus Chun stood in the primary coordination center aboard Nexus Prime, surrounded by displays that tracked the progress of primitive fleet operations throughout the galaxy. The center itself represented a perfect example of the technological transformation that had swept through galactic civilization. Advanced holographic displays had been replaced with simple visual monitors. Quantum communication networks had been supplemented with basic radio systems. Computational analysis was now supported by mechanical calculating devices operated by beings whose species had transcended such tools millions of years ago. The primitive fleet had grown to over 1,500 ships, each one deliberately built using technology that any galactic civilization could have constructed in their pre-spaceflight era. They operated in squadrons throughout the dead zones, systematically locating and disabling the artificial amplifiers that had been driving dimensional decay. The operation was proceeding ahead of schedule and below budget, two outcomes that were almost unheard of in advanced civilizational projects. Commander Zeph 9947, whose crystalline structure had been permanently modified to allow better interaction with primitive tools, was coordinating fleet operations using a combination of basic radio communications and mechanical plotting devices. His species' computational abilities, rather than being diminished by the primitive approach, had actually been enhanced by the requirement to think in simpler, more direct patterns. Human Marcus, his harmonic voice carried notes of satisfaction that his species associated with the successful completion of complex calculations. Fleet Group 7 has successfully disabled the amplifier complex in Sector Null 23. That represents the 47th amplifier network eliminated since the beginning of operations. Dimensional decay rates in cleared sectors have decreased by an average of 73%. General Mordak was tracking overall strategic progress using techniques that combined advanced strategic thinking with primitive implementation methods. His massive form had adapted to working with simple tools in ways that his warriors found both inspiring and amusing. The enemy's response patterns are absent. He reported with the confusion of a military mind encountering a situation without precedent. Our forces have eliminated nearly half of the artificial amplifier networks throughout the galaxy, and we have detected no countermeasures, no defensive responses, no adaptation to our tactics. Dr. Keth Mori, whose understanding of dimensional mechanics had been revolutionized by the requirement to think in primitive terms, was monitoring the overall dimensional stability of the galaxy using instruments so simple that they measured quantum fluctuations by observing the behavior of suspended metal pendulums. The improvement in dimensional stability is beyond our most optimistic projections. His ethereal voice carried notes of philosophical wonder. The artificial amplifiers were apparently operating far more efficiently than we understood. Each disabled network has a cumulative effect on overall galactic stability. Marcus nodded as he reviewed progress reports that were written on actual paper and delivered by beings who traveled between monitoring stations using simple mechanical transport. The primitive approach was working better than anyone had dared to hope, but he was troubled by something that the others had noted but not fully grasped. "The lack of response is what worries me," he said, voicing concerns that had been growing for weeks. The entities behind this operation invested enormous resources in destroying our galaxy. They built hundreds of amplifier networks, developed technologies that operate across dimensional boundaries, coordinated an operation spanning millions of years. That level of investment suggests a long-term strategic plan, not just casual predation. He turned to face the assembled coordinators, and his expression carried the weight of someone who understood that their success might be incomplete. "We've been operating on the assumption that disabling the amplifiers would solve our problem. But what if the amplifiers were just the first stage of whatever these entities have planned? What if we've only eliminated the tools they were using to prepare our galaxy for something else?" The question hung in the air with a weight that seemed to affect the physical environment around them. The possibility that their successful primitive fleet operations had only addressed a preliminary threat rather than the primary danger transformed their victories from solutions into merely tactical successes. Ambassador Thrill-Ek, whose pattern recognition abilities had been crucial throughout the primitive fleet project, was the first to process the implications of Marcus's concern. "Human Marcus, you are suggesting that the dimensional decay was not the end goal of these entities, but rather a preparatory process for some other objective?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus said carefully, "that beings capable of engineering dimensional decay on a galactic scale probably have objectives that extend beyond simple destruction. The amplifiers weren't just destroying our galaxy, they were transforming it, changing its fundamental dimensional characteristics in ways that might make it suitable for purposes that we haven't considered." Dr. Kethmori's ethereal form became almost completely solid as he focused his entire consciousness on analyzing this possibility. If the dimensional decay was a preparation phase, then halting that process might trigger the entities to move to whatever they had planned as the next phase of their operation. As if summoned by their conversation, alarm signals began to sound throughout the coordination center. But these were not the sophisticated alert systems that advanced civilizations normally used. They were simple mechanical bells and electrical sirens that anyone could hear and understand regardless of their species' normal communication methods. Navigator Ysestil from the outer colonies rushed into the coordination center carrying a primitive radio receiver that was crackling with transmissions from primitive fleet units throughout the galaxy. Her species' natural agility allowed her to operate the simple equipment with impressive efficiency despite its unfamiliar interface. "Urgent transmissions from all fleet groups," she reported breathlessly. Massive energy signatures appearing throughout cleared sectors. New structures materializing in locations where amplifier networks were successfully disabled. Configuration unknown, but definitely artificial. Marcus felt his stomach sink as his worst fears began to be realized. The entities behind the dimensional decay had indeed been preparing for something else, and the primitive fleet's success in disabling the amplifiers had apparently triggered the next phase of their plan. Commander Zeph 9947's computational abilities were already processing the tactical implications. If new hostile structures are appearing in sectors where we have established operational control, our primitive fleets may be trapped in environments that have been fundamentally altered while they were operating. General Mordak's strategic mind was thinking in terms of immediate response options. We need to establish contact with fleet units and coordinate withdrawal from potentially compromised sectors. However, our communication systems may be inadequate for coordinating operations across such a wide area under emergency conditions. Marcus was already moving toward the primitive communication equipment, but his mind was working on multiple levels simultaneously. The immediate priority was ensuring the survival of the primitive fleet crews who might be trapped in sectors that were undergoing unknown transformations. But beyond that, he needed to understand what the entities had actually been planning and whether the primitive approach that had been so successful against the amplifiers would be effective against whatever was happening now. All stations, this is Nexus Prime coordination. He spoke into the simple radio transmitter that connected them to primitive fleet units throughout the galaxy. Emergency protocols are now in effect. All fleet units report status and begin immediate documentation of any new phenomena in your operational areas. Do not attempt to engage unknown structures until we understand what we're dealing with. The responses came back through primitive radio channels, creating a cacophony of voices that would have challenged advanced translation systems, but which proved manageable for beings who had learned to operate simple equipment through direct practice rather than technological interface. Fleet Group 3 reporting massive crystalline structures materializing throughout Sector Null 15. Configuration suggests artificial construction, but operating principles unknown. Fleet Group 12 observing energy vortex formation in cleared area of Sector Null 31. Dimensional readings indicate stable portal structures of some kind. Fleet Group 7 detecting artificial gravity wells appearing around disabled amplifier locations. Effect appears to be creating stable zones within dead zone environments. As the reports continued to arrive, a pattern began to emerge that was both terrifying and enlightening. The entities weren't responding to the destruction of their amplifiers with countermeasures or repairs. Instead, they were moving forward with whatever the amplifiers had been designed to enable. Dr. Keth Mori was analyzing the incoming data using primitive computational methods, his ethereal consciousness working through mathematical frameworks so simple that they could be performed using mechanical calculators and written notation. The energy signatures suggest dimensional portal technology far beyond anything in our theoretical understanding. The entities appear to be establishing permanent gateways between their dimensional framework and our galaxy. Ambassador ThrillX pattern recognition abilities were identifying connections that purely logical analysis might have missed. Human Marcus. The locations of the new structures correspond precisely to the amplifier sites that our primitive fleets disabled most recently. The entities may have been waiting for us to clear away the amplifiers because the amplifiers were interfering with whatever they wanted to build in those locations. The full scope of the situation was becoming clear, and it was both worse and more complex than anything they had anticipated. The dimensional decay hadn't been an attack. It had been preparation for invasion. The amplifiers hadn't been weapons. They had been clearing tools designed to create suitable conditions for establishing dimensional portals. And the primitive fleet's successful mission had actually completed the preparation work that the entities needed to proceed with their real plan. Marcus felt a familiar sensation, the same combination of determination and refusal to accept impossibility that had driven human civilization through every major crisis in their history. The entities had indeed been more sophisticated than anyone had realized, but they had also made the same fundamental error that advanced civilizations consistently made. They had assumed that their targets would respond according to predictable patterns. All coordinators, listen carefully, he said, his voice carrying the